So we are continuing in this section in 2 Corinthians, where Paul's talking about this issue that he's having with the Corinthian church that they're somewhat upset about at this point, either some of them or all of them, or maybe just one or two of them. Last week we ended with verse 22, so we're going to be jumping in with verse 23, but what I want to do before we get into verse 23 is actually read the final verse, the verse that we're going to go up to today. We're talking about this thing called love, and in our society today, love, man. If you ask somebody, would you define love for me? I mean, you get a variety of answers. The reason why is because we use love for a whole bunch of different things. We use love for our spouse. We use love when we're talking about I love my dog, I love a cheeseburger. We use it for like a broad spectrum of things. And so when we actually try to sit down and ask what does the Bible actually say about it, it can get a little bit sticky. Here's what this passage is not talking about. This is not talking about the husband-wife kind of love. When Paul's talking about his love for the Corinthian church, he's not talking about that kind of love. So you can toss that to the side. We're not talking about that today. What we are talking about, I'll read it to you. It's in chapter 2, verse 4. Paul says this, "For I wrote you out of much affliction and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you." So Paul's going to talk about, this is the issue we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Paul said he was going to go back to the Corinthian church after he spent a year and a half with them, and up to this point, he hasn't. Now, Paul decided at some point, instead of going back to them, I'm going to write them a letter and send it to them. For whatever reason, Paul decided this was a better idea. We're going to talk about why he says that was a better idea. But the Corinthian church is like, hey, you said you were going to come back to us, and instead, we got a letter. So what gives? And so Paul's going to go through that explanation. But the reason why I wanted to read chapter 2, verse 4 for you first is so that you understand what Paul's heart is, what his intention is. He's going to tell them why he changed his mind. But I want you to know that it's because of love that's motivating Paul to do what he does. So, in this passage that we're going to read today, he's not actually going to teach us about love. There's a couple different ways you can teach people. You can tell them, and he does that a lot of different times. We just read a dialogue where he was teaching the Corinthians about who God is, last week. He's not going to teach them what love is. There's a second way to teach people what something is. It's to show them. So this is not going to be Paul going at us, telling us, this is what love looks like. This is what love should be like. He's just going to show the Corinthian church what that looks like. So as we're reading, we're going to be looking for how does Paul demonstrate what the Bible would teach is a healthy form of love. And we're going to evaluate that way, using Paul as an example. So how does Paul's actions define what love's supposed to look like? So go back up to verse 23, and we'll start with his explanation as to why he wrote them a letter instead of coming to them, which obviously offended some people. Chapter 1, verse 23 says this, "But I call God to witness against me." Okay, we saw him in the last section make a pretty bold statement. He said, "As surely as God is faithful," and then he goes on talking about his own faithfulness. Now he's saying, I'm going to call God to witness against me, which basically means, here's what he's saying to the church. If you're going to put me on trial, if I'm the defendant, defending my actions, then I'm calling God to witness for me. So he thinks he's in the right, and he's pretty sure of it. So much so that he's willing to call God to witness against him if he's lying or not telling the truth. Pretty bold statement up front. Second half of the verse says this, "It was to spare you that I refrained from coming again to Corinth. So here's the first thing that we find from Paul's example about love and what love's supposed to look like. Sometimes love means sparing unnecessary pain. Sparing unnecessary pain. I don't know what Paul was sparing them from. Maybe it was the embarrassment. If he's already written them a letter, or if he hasn't written them a letter yet, but they have this issues going on, which they know Paul is hearing about, maybe it's a more personal way to get at them instead of coming and drawing a crowd. Because as soon as he walks into Corinth, these were not big towns. Okay? So if he walks into town and everybody knows what's been going on, there's a good chance he draws a crowd. Good chance he walks in, and when he's rebuking or telling people they shouldn't live a certain way, there's going to be a crowd. So maybe a letter just to them reduces some of the embarrassment factor. Maybe it's a form of not exercising power. He's an apostle of God. He could have come in there with that whip that Jesus had in the temple and could have just gone ham on whatever it is that he was having an issue with. But he didn't. He said, it was to spare you that I did not come to you. So first thing we see, love spares unnecessary pain. If it's not to exercise power over somebody, read the next verse. This might be what he's talking about. In verse 24, it says this. He says, not that we lord it over your faith. And the question is, Lord, what over your faith? Well, he just spent the whole chapter defending his authority as an apostle. How many times in the first chapter did he say he was an apostle of Christ? I mean, he could have come into the Corinthian church and been like, who the heck are you guys? You want to disobey me? You want to not do what I say? You want to call me somebody I'm not? He could have come in and just wreaked havoc with the authority that God had given him. Instead, he says, not to lord it over you, I spared you. Didn't come to you. Unnecessary pain comes when we use our power abusively. He had that authority. He could have. But he chose not to. Because sometimes love spares unnecessary pain. Unnecessary pain comes when people work against you. Read the next section of verse 24. It says, but we work with you for your joy. So instead of abusing you with our power, the power that we rightfully have, and letting you know about it, this is the person who wants to tell you something you're doing wrong, and they do, and they're right, but they scream it at you instead of just telling you. Or they add on the end of what they're telling you those last 15 things that you did wrong as well. Or they're adding on the end of, this is what you did wrong. Oh, and by the way, you're a beep, 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 beep. Okay, not wrong, not untruthful, but abusing the power. And Paul says love, or demonstrates that love is working with people for their joy instead of working against them. And then Paul's kind of funny. He knows that there's some distance. He knows that there's some beef between them. And to prove exactly what he's saying, he throws in these little encouragements to the Corinthian church. It's kind of funny. They're kind of random until you start reading more and more of them and understand exactly what he's saying, and that he's in it so that they would mutually boast of one another. We talked about that. That's in verse 14 a couple weeks ago. he throws in these little encouragements. It's the last part of verse 24. He says, "For you stand firm in your faith." That's not a command. That's an indicative statement. He's telling them who they are. Remember, Corinthian church? You're the ones who stand firm. You're the ones who don't waver side to side. You're the ones who know the truth and cling to it. So in the midst of, he knows that he's hurt them. We're going to get to that. He also knows that he did it lovingly. He knows that his motivation was their mutual joy. He knows that their motivation was that they would boast mutually in one another. And in the midst of all that, you can tell because he gives the Corinthian church these encouragements. You're the one who stands firm. You know these things. Read verse 1 of chapter 2. It says this, "For I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you." When you're going through life with relationships with people, a lot of times they can be going really well. This was Paul and the Corinthian church. They were doing really well. Having really good relations with each other. 1.5 years, they spent a lot of time together. It was good. Somewhere along the line, somebody took a hard right. And the relationship changed. A lot of times today, we cling on to relationships that were headed in a good direction at the beginning, but then when somebody takes a hard right, we're not quite sure when to let go or how to respond. A lot of us just keep going. No, this person's great. I know them. They're great. They're awesome. They're a drunk. Yeah, but they didn't used to be. They used to be really good. Yeah, but they're not anymore. Here's a second thing. Here's another thing that is a part of sparing unnecessary pain. Love sometimes changes its mind. And I got to be honest, in the world, this doesn't sit too well. What do you mean you're going to change your mind? You're going to change your mind about your best friend? You're going to change your mind about, yeah. Because what the person used to be doing, which was trustworthy, they're now no longer doing and now no longer trustworthy. So for you to continue trusting them with money again and again and again when they don't steward it well, but they used to, okay, but they don't anymore. So what was loving to do to help them out, to be gracious with them before, now is enabling and now is no longer loving. That's what Paul does here. Changes his mind. We were in the right direction, Church of Corinth. We were doing good things. We were working together well. And somewhere you took a hard right. And so he says, I made up my mind. In other words, it could be translated, I changed my mind not to make another painful visit to you. Part of sparing unnecessary pain is realizing when circumstances have changed. It's just not the same anymore. And so now my love for you is going to have to look different. It can't look the same as it always did. Here's the deal. This has to be true for everybody because all of us are walking through life and we all have trials. And we all change. We all have struggles. We're constantly in change. One pastor I heard said it like this: you're either in a storm, or you're headed out of a storm, or you're headed into a storm. So if life's constantly changing, then how we love people is going to have to constantly change too. It's going to have to be grounded in a whole lot of grace, but it's going to have to be realistic. Paul was headed one way with the Corinthian church, and he expressed that to them. And in the last passage, he said, I wasn't wavering when I said I wanted to come to you. I wanted to come to you, but now circumstances have changed. So I changed my mind. It's harder to live that way. And it's hard to explain that to people. You used to do this for me. How come you don't do it for me anymore? Things have changed. Now this is the best way that I can love you. Because circumstances aren't the same. Some Christians specifically, because the world criticizes us for it, maybe are a little bit overzealous, trying to get the whole rest of the world to live by a book or a set of standards that they don't believe in. But that wasn't Paul. If anything, in this case, he said it was to spare you that I refrained from coming. He wasn't interested in pulling out the whip and telling them how horrible they were. He did do that in certain circumstances. Go read Galatians, where he says again and again and again, "Oh, foolish Galatians." All right, so there was a time for that. But here, not. This is why love is so complicated. It requires different things at different times. It's not easy to figure out. But we have some examples here, at least from Paul in this situation. Read verse 2. Chapter 2, verse 2 says, "For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained?" And then verse 3, "And I wrote as I did, so that when I came I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice, for I felt sure of you all." Hear the encouragement again. "I felt sure of you all, that my joy would be the joy of you all." Here's the second thing Paul demonstrates for us here. If the first one's that love spares unnecessary pain, then the second one is that love endures necessary pain. Some people want to say, well, if love spares unnecessary pain, well, I'm just going to avoid pain altogether. That must be what loving is like. Today, in our culture, loving looks like acceptance. You can disagree with me, but most of the time, I've found Christians are criticized. If you live a certain way and you try to tell somebody else they're going to be hurting or in pain or struggling if they continue to live that way, they say, well, that's not loving. They're trying to hold me to a standard. Why don't you just accept me for who I am? Love spares unnecessary pain, but it endures necessary pain. The irony is that Paul said, "For if I caused you pain," in verse 2, "who is there to make me glad but the one I have pained?" Ironically, he did cause them pain. That wasn't his goal, that wasn't his intention, but because of the way they were living, because of the things that they were doing, it was necessary. And he didn't shy away from that, even though he said, it wasn't my intention. He's going to talk about that more in chapter 7, so we're not going to unpack that here. We're going to wait till chapter 7 when he unpacks it a whole lot more. But he doesn't shy away from what he would say is necessary pain. This is the same concept in the Bible that we hear about with the verse that gets thrown all over the place, talking about how iron sharpens iron. Talking about human beings making each other better. But sharpening iron is, well, if the iron could feel, would suck. I mean, you're taking a metal blade and shing. There's nothing fun about that. There's nothing fun about that kind of love. There's nothing fun about, hey, here's an impurity in your life. Let me help you remove it. And you can tell by Paul's description in verse 4. He says, "For I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart with many tears." His goal was to love them. He did it by sparing them in every way that he could. He also didn't shy away from what needed to be said. Love spares unnecessary pain and endures necessary pain. Did you hear the encouragement he had in verse 3? For I felt sure of you all. You could translate that, I was having confidence, continually, ongoing. I was having confidence in you guys. That verb actually doesn't end. In the English, it's translated like a past tense because it's really hard to have the ongoing action with a verb like that. But in the Greek, it's ongoing. It's not, I was having confidence in the past. It's, I'm having confidence in you right now. He doesn't think they're too far gone. He's not interested in telling them how terrible they are. But he is willing to endure the pain necessary. He also says this, in verse 3, he says that my joy would be the joy of you all. He's going to come back to that in chapter 3 and unpack that a little bit more. He's going to basically tell the Corinthian church, you're my offering to God. You're the evidence that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. He's going to talk about that in chapter 3, so we're not going to talk about that today. But it goes back to that idea in verse 14 in chapter 1 of the mutual boasting. They want to boast together about one another. It's the whole reason Paul wanted to come to them in the first place. And yet, he writes them this letter instead because he wants them to know of the abundant love he has for them. You may have seen in verse 4, it says, for I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart. The much affliction is actually literally physical pain. Ever been hurt that way before? Emotional, mental pain, that's the anguish of heart. But so much so that it's caused affliction, which is physical pain. He's torn up over this. This is not just, I wrote you a letter out of anger. This is not just, you accused me and that was wrong and you're wrong and I'm just going to write you a letter and lambast you with it. This is Paul saying, I'm hurt and you're hurt. And we need to sort this out. It's his way of sparing them and at the same time enduring the necessary pain. You may have heard the description, anguish of heart, and thought, well, how can you be anguished in heart? Some people who are a little more in touch with emotions can say, oh yeah, I get that. I can, you feel it right there. Maybe you've felt it before. If you remember when we were talking about the heart in the Psalms months ago, we talked about how in the Old Testament, the heart is the center of everything. It's the center for intellectual activity. It is descriptions of you thinking with your heart and you feel with your heart. The heart's an organ in the Old Testament. Paul's a Hebrew. And he knows his Old Testament. So when he says to the church of Corinth, anguish of heart, I think it's his way of describing everything. Every part of him, mind, body, just everything is hurting. Because it's not fun to tell people what they need to hear when you know it's going to hurt. I don't know what to think about it. When Chris and I were first dating, one of the hot buttons for me, personally, was music. I grew up listening to Christian music. It was the only thing my parents let me listen to. And when I got into high school, I was so sick of not knowing what everybody else was listening to. I'd go to dances and not know any of the songs. And people would talk about this music and that music. And I'd be like, I have no clue what you're talking about. Here's my Plus One or Skillet or something or TFK, and they were like, who any of those people are. And so when I got to high school, I was like, I'm done with this. I got a car. I listen to whatever I want, whenever I want. And so I did. And as life started to kind of spiral when I was in high school, get involved with the wrong crowd and started to make some bad decisions, I stepped back one day and looked at the music I was listening to and was like, what am I listening to? And I'm singing like I know every word of this song. I don't believe any of that. And so for me, it became a choice where I was like, no, I'm going back. I can't do this. This is pumping just garbage into me. And so for me, it was a hot button. And so when I dated people, it became a hot button. And I dated people who were unwilling to consider Christian music or even listen to it. And it became a huge source of tension. So when I first met Carissa, who grew up listening to country music, and then when she was in high school, hit the rap train, and that's where she was at. And when I met her, she'd only been a Christian for like a year and a half. And so she was like, yeah, I've heard some of those, Christian-y songs at church every once in a while, but, this is what I listen to. One day we were in the car. I'm not sure this was my brightest moment. One day we were in the car, and this rap song on her car, and I was sitting there going, I don't even want to deal with this. And we just started dating. I'm not going to bring this up. Like, this is ridiculous. And then she's rapping. I mean, she's like, da-da-da, everywhere, like, boom, boom. And I can share this because she's in California this weekend. Just kidding. I'll tell her. I already told her. And I said to her, not in the moment, this is like later on. I said, you remember we were in the car, we were listening to music, and do you know what you were singing? And she's like, maybe, no, not really. I don't really remember. I was like, okay, so let me tell you what you were singing. And I said to her, when you can sing entire songs like that, and those words come out of your mouth, that's not attractive to me. And she was like, and I thought about it afterwards. I thought, maybe that was a little harsh. But it was the truth. And I had spent time in relationships where I tried to get that across to people, and they wasn't an issue for them. They were like, yeah, just going to have to deal with it. And so I needed her to understand up front, this was a big deal. Obviously, we worked that out. Because there's been some things that I've had to change, and for her, that was one thing she was willing to change. In fact, her response to that whole conversation after she was a little bit sticker shock was, yeah, I can change. And I was like, what? Nobody's ever said that to me. Nobody's ever wanted to do that for me. But it's tough. Nobody likes having those conversations. That was the last thing I wanted to say to her, but also didn't want to be in a relationship with somebody who I knew was going to be an issue with for the rest of forever. Love endures necessary pain, even if it's hard. But it also spares unnecessary pain. So abuse just doesn't keep spinning and going on and on and on. If you're wondering, where does Paul get this picture of love? Like, how does he even learn this stuff? I mean, he knows a lot of his Old Testament, but most people think God in the Old Testament is just full of hate and anger and condemnation. So yeah, he's a Hebrew. Great. Where does he get this picture of love? We could go find a few places like Hosea where he gets this picture of love, or Isaiah 53 where you see the suffering servant. And you could see even in the Old Testament where he gets this picture of love, but it's here that Paul gets this picture of love. This is 1 John 3:16, not John 3:16, the one that everybody knows. This is 1 John 3:16. This is from his letter. The Apostle John says this, We know love by this, that he, that is Jesus, laid down his life for us. We know love because he laid down his life for us. And Paul knows that love spares unnecessary pain because Christ took the pain. Paul knows that love endures necessary pain because there was a God who stepped out of heaven and said, there's necessary pain for me to endure because I love them. If we want to be people who avoid unnecessary pain, but endure necessary pain, it all comes from here. The body and blood of Christ all comes from the cross. Without that, first of all, there is no love. Everybody ends up in hell. Woo. With that changes everything. Some people in the world, they want to say, well, how is it that a loving God can send some people to hell for all eternity? What kind of love is that? And there's a big issue with people who look at God and they say, God's not loving. No loving being would send people to hell for all eternity. And it's a valid argument from a human perspective. When we look at God and say, how unfair. If God's an eternal being and we offended him, then our offense is eternal. And there's no way that a created being can pay an eternal punishment. It's just not possible. You get that if you offend an eternal being, then a punishment has to be eternal. This is not a how unfair God question. This is there's no other option. You offend an eternal being, your offense is eternal. You want a punishment that's eternal, then you got to punish something that's eternal. See, if you take the deity out of Jesus, if you take the eternality out of the body and blood of Christ, you don't have salvation. You can't. Not if you offended an eternal God. It's not a question of fairness from us. This is a question of whether or not Jesus Christ was actually able to endure the pain that you and I caused. He did. We do communion first and third Sundays of every month because we want to continually remember again and again and again and again that love's not possible without this. That this is the picture of love enduring. The necessary pain. Jesus didn't come to everybody in the world and say, you all are great, wonderful people. I love you so much. Some people he said that to. Some people he said, you hypocrites. Because it was necessary. They needed to hear it. Love is balance. It takes practice. It's hard. Find a way to spare people unnecessary pain. Find a way to endure necessary pain.